Nick, you were talking about community violence and community violence having a really specific definition. So tell us a little bit about that definition.
Sure. And Will, do you also want me to recap some of the stuff around context?
If you don't
So
mind, just
to
yeah, just give us a brief summary.
Absolutely. So I think before the storm cut us out, what I was talking about is that when we talk about gun violence, we have to treat it like a public health issue because, like a lot of public health issues, if not all of them, gun violence behaves like a disease where it concentrates, it spreads, in this case, like a social contagion. And also, like any disease, you generally do good work in preventing it and its spread by interrupting the transmission, treating those at highest risk, and working to change norms of behaviors around that problem, right? And public health approaches to gun violence also fall under the general public health approach more broadly, which is us defining the problem and scoping it out, understanding the risk factors that drive it and the protective factors that inhibit it, was based on the literature and in talking with people impacted, practitioners doing the work, and subject matter experts. And then based on that understanding, developing solutions with those partners to address it, testing if they work, and if they do, going to widespread adoption. And so the entire conversation we'll get through is through that lens of this being a public health issue that has to be treated with a public health approach. And when we move to community violence, I think first I wanted to help the audience understand, if they don't already, just the level of gun violence in the United States, period. So when we look at the homicide rate in the United States, we not only have the highest homicide rate by far of any developed nation in the world, but when we also look at some of our cities most impacted by gun violence in the US, places like Baltimore, St. Louis, Detroit, for example, they tend to also fall, of any cities in the world, along with a number of Central American countries as well, in those cities most impacted by violence. And that includes not just developed nations, but developing ones. So this is a really chronic, substantial public health issue in the United States. And I want to make that clear. Moving on to different types of gun violence, which is where community violence is going to come out, is that if we look at in a given year, and what I'm about to say is true for most localities in the United States and is also true for the work I do in and around the city of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County and the surrounding areas. When we look at gun violence in the US in a given year, half of it is self-inflicted. So half of all deaths by gun are suicide. When we focus on gun violence against others, which is the area I focus on, particularly with community violence, we have to break it down as follows. So getting again to community violence, the specific definition that we have is that this is gun violence and other acts of violence, such as stabbings and beatings, but mainly gun violence that happens between unrelated individuals in our public spaces. Sometimes it spills over into private spaces, but overwhelmingly is in our public spaces. So if we look at community violence under that definition, in the US overall and here locally, it's about 80% of our deaths against others caused by gun are in the context of community violence. So overwhelmingly, it is the driver of gun violence deaths in the United States against other people. We go to the next biggest category, it's domestic violence. And that definition is this is violence, including gun violence, against related individuals. And it tends to occur in our private spaces, such as the home. And that can be not just family members by relation, but also intimate partners who are in romantic relationships. In a given year, that's about 15 to 20% of our deaths caused by gun that are, again, against others in terms of interpersonal acts of violence. And sort of the last category is what probably most people are familiar with, which is just mass shootings. And mass shootings, the generally agreed upon definition is that these are simply 4 or more shootings that happen around the same time and the same place. And we have mass shootings that also meet the definition of community violence, meet the definition of domestic violence, and mass shootings that fall somewhere else. They could be based on hate crimes, based on misogynistic acts, etc. Regardless, mass shootings nationally and also here locally and where I work typically make up the smallest proportion of gun violence, usually a percent or two in a given year. This is not saying that we shouldn't care about mass shootings, our domestic violence, our community violence, especially more broadly, given its size of the share of gun violence against others. We should care about all of them. But I think community violence, in my experience, tends to get covered the least, even though it's the most of the gun deaths against other people. So with all that in mind, some other factors I wanted to talk about in terms of setting the context around gun violence before we jump into some of the solutions we're delivering are the following. So I kind of already alluded to it a bit with the public health definition and how gun violence acts like a disease, but gun violence is not remotely random in the United States, contrary to popular belief. This is a deeply concentrated problem. It's concentrated geographically, demographically, and socially, and I'll get into that. So geographically, and what I'm about to say is talking about, again, where I work in Pittsburgh and the surrounding areas that make up Allegheny County. But what I'm about to say is true of literally every locality I have seen and read about in the entire United States. So when we talk about the geographic concentration, gun violence occurs in just a few of our highest need neighborhoods and is often, even within those neighborhoods, concentrated to just a few blocks. And even within those blocks, tends to concentrate further still around certain nuisance properties, our vacant properties, are places where people that are highest risk tend to gather or congregate. So there's extreme geographic concentration in this. To give people context, here in Allegheny County, we have 30,000 blocks that you can walk down, census blocks. On average, gun violence occurs in just 0.3% of them. That's how deeply concentrated this issue is. And as we'll get into in a minute, it tends to be those blocks within our highest need communities. And we'll get to those risk factors momentarily. The second concentration I mentioned is demographic concentration. And this is pretty key, connected to your initial question, Will, around how this intersects with race. And as we'll get to contextualizing this problem further still, racism in the United States. But when we talk about the demographic group most impacted, again, we have to look at it intersectionally, particularly around race, class, gender, and age. So this is overwhelmingly, not just locally, but for the US as a whole, low to moderate income, young Black men. And more specifically, when I say young, overwhelmingly between the ages of 18 to 34 in terms of those who are victimized and those who are involved in acts of gun violence. In fact, victims and those who are involved look almost identical around not just a variety of risk factors that may drive them to that involvement or victimization, but in other characteristics involving service involvement, carceral involvement, et cetera, which I'm sure we can get into in more detail throughout the conversation. So that's the demographic concentration. To illustrate this point even further, in Allegheny County, for example, 6% of the county is Black men, and in a given year, they're 80% of the victims. That is a difference of kind, not degree. It's even more intense if we account for the population size in a different way, where you look at, say, the average homicide rate per capita. So the average Black homicide rate in Allegheny County is 30 times larger than the average white homicide rate per capita. When we talk about racial differences, which I know, again, is a key thing you all explore on this channel, Will, there is not a greater racial disparity that I am aware of than racial disparities in homicide and gun violence victimization. So that's the demographic concentration. And last is the social concentration, which is really key. So I talked about the few neighborhoods it occurs in, which tend to be higher need. And within those neighborhoods, those who are involved and victimized tend to be, again, young Black men who are low to moderate income and have a number of other risk factors that they have experienced in their lives. But you have to be even more specific, because most people in our neighborhoods most impacted by gun violence are not at all involved in gun violence. On average, here in Allegheny County, we estimate that 0.2%, that's how small, of those in our poorest neighborhoods most impacted by gun violence are involved in 100% of that gun violence. And so even if you are a young Black man in a poor neighborhood, it does not necessarily mean you are involved or victimized by gun violence, although the reality of that affects your life in almost every way. which we can get into more when we talk about the effects of this more broadly in these communities. But it is a very small percentage of the population involved in this issue and victimized by this issue. The other things I want to say that drive that concentration in terms of risk factors, again, I'll speak shortly here, but we can delve into these later if you'd like. I would say there are 5 main categories of risk that, when intersected, really contribute to this concentration geographically, demographically, socially. Broadly, I would say they are cultural and societal factors, community level risk factors, relational risk factors, individual and developmental risk factors, and lastly, behavioral risk factors. And again, happy to explore those more as we continue the conversation. When we put all those things together, I think those contribute. And particularly when we talk about community level risk factors, such as racial segregation, which with it often comes the concentration of poverty, social isolation from key institutions, networks, and opportunities, legal cynicism resulting from over-involvement, disproportional harassment from our carceral systems, and things like a lot of people who are experiencing issues retreating inward because of safety reasons, are wanting to keep to themselves because of the challenge they experience. These are all risk factors that are significant predictors of the concentration of gun violence. And when we talk about those specifically, community level risk factors and some of these societal level risk factors I'll get to, we cannot talk about any of this without the context of structural racism, structural classism, and also, I would argue, other factors that led to the concentration of poverty in the United States, such as deindustrialization, economic restructuring. So if I had to talk about that briefly, because again, we could have a long conversation on just that, when we talk about why our neighborhoods have such divergent conditions and factors, risk and protective, that lead to, say, concentrations of things like gun violence, we have to talk about the reality of decades of discriminatory housing, lending, and land use policy, which itself was an evolution out of Jim Crow, the Great Migration of people moving to the North to escape persecution and seek economic opportunity, and were met with these discriminatory housing, lending, and land use laws, which itself is obviously followed by the reality of slavery in the United States. And in addition to all of those laws, from redlining to blockbusting to contract housing to the racial composition and neighborhood composition rule with where public housing was placed, all of that in between led to what is now our deeply segregated neighborhoods, if not the reinforcement of what was already segregated based on a number of other barriers prior to the advent of a lot of these laws in the early 20th to mid 20th century. And then also we have to talk about outmigration and the impacts of deindustrialization and economic restructuring, which I talked about, which hit low to moderate income communities of all races hard, but particularly hard are Black communities, given their overrepresentation in those industries to begin with because of lack of opportunity in other industries. We also have to talk about crack cocaine and the war on drugs, which occurred in the 70s and 80s as an epidemic. And our response to that epidemic wasn't a public health approach. It was almost entirely punitive. And there's evidence that further destabilized communities that were already hurting from the factors I just talked about, whether it's outmigration, deindustrialization, or the discriminatory laws that came before them and continued after them, even when they were illegal, in terms of people acting on those discriminatory policies. And then lastly, coming with all this, persistent disinvestment and abandonment, which continues to this day. The reality of lasting economic and racial segregation is just that, it's a reality. In a lot of the US, outside of some of our coastal cities, most of our neighborhoods that were poor and segregated 40, 50 years ago are still to that day. And given the risk factors they carry for things, again, like the concentration of gun violence, this is still a reality to this day because it has not been addressed in a meaningful way. And that leads me to the last part of this sort of context setup. And I realize it's a lot of context setup, but this is a complex problem that deserves this context, is that, as I alluded to before, this doesn't only just hurt disproportionately those young Black men, primarily ages 18 to 34, but it affects entire communities. We have tons of evidence that exposure to gun violence in these communities, even if you're not the one most directly impacted, leads to almost every negative outcome you could think about in the book, whether it's academic outcomes, graduation outcomes, mental and physical health outcomes, social mobility outcomes, everything. I would argue when we talk about how important place is and what makes place so important in shaping our outcomes, there's probably not a factor more, in my opinion, than exposure or not to gun violence that makes neighborhoods matter so much, beyond obviously other factors we know that matter. And then given all that context, this is preventable. And that leads to sort of, the setup of, some of the work I've been involved in the past few years, which is that if this issue is so focused, and it's focused because of the risk factors that we talked about more broadly, then if we address those risk factors in the immediate sense, in the midterm sense, in the long-term sense, we can significantly reduce gun violence. So it takes an understanding of this problem to create an effective prescription and solution.